Good morning, everybody. Welcome to webinar number 7 in the series of climate change and the African food entrepreneur. I really cannot believe that we are at number 7 already. The last few weeks seem to have just flown by, and I take that as a good thing. And thank you all for continuing to join us in this journey and being so interactive with us, not just through the Zoom webinars, but also through your emails and messages that you've been sending to us. So thank you. And I'm really pleased, and I say this really genuinely, that so many people have been visiting our YouTube sites to actually find out about the previous webinars. So the opportunity to rewatch the recordings of our previous webinars, but also for those people who weren't able to join but had registered, the opportunity to find out what they had missed. So thank you all for your engagement. Today we are talking about regenerative agriculture, which is a really important topic and something that really does bring together all of the conversations that we've had so far, particularly those about soil, water, and agroforestry. Now, today we're talking about regenerative agriculture. Now, there's some good news and possibly bad news. It depends how you want to accept it. Unfortunately, our fantastic keynote speaker had to withdraw. So today's webinar is going to be managed solely by the Agripreneurship Alliance. Now, that's great for us because it means that we can actually share some of our ideas and our knowledge directly. What it means is that we do not have a voice of somebody who is deeply embedded in regenerative agriculture, nor an entrepreneur who is able to speak about their experience. But what we want to do today is really try to dig down and talk about what regenerative agriculture actually means to somebody who is running a farm in Africa, and look at some of the techniques and approaches that are important and needed to move forwards in a regenerative agriculture context. But I'm throwing this word regenerative agriculture around a lot, and I'm not sure if I even fully understand what it means. And so what I have asked is my very good friend and colleague, John Mugonya, who's our program manager in Uganda, to join us to explain a little about regenerative agriculture in the round, what it means, and how it goes forwards. So John, are you there?
Yes, Steven, I'm here.
It's great for you to join us from Kampala today. Could you take us through, please, the topic of regenerative agriculture?
Thank you very much, Steven. I'll gladly introduce the topic. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you're joining us, and today we are talking about regenerative agriculture. To begin with, the world today is facing 3 crises, which are interconnected. That is the food crisis, the climate change crisis, and also the loss of biodiversity. So players, actors in all those 3 areas are looking for ways on how to improve on the existing systems, but also ensure that we do not lose what we have left. So regenerative agriculture comes in handy. And what does it mean? Regenerative agriculture is basically that system of farming or approach to farming that mimics nature. So you are growing crops and rearing animals in ways that relate to how they would live in the wild. So there are many other words that are close to regenerative agriculture, and these include agroecology, smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, name them. But the overall idea is to ensure that you do as much good for the environment as possible, for the soil, for water conservation, for the energy as you grow your foods, so that you reduce the carbon footprint, but also ensure the sustainability of the system that feeds us. So one word I would like to end with on this slide is the one health. So at the center of this, you want to be sure that humans are healthy, the ecosystem healthy, as well as the animals. Next slide, Steve. So we have prepared a video which is placed in somewhere in Kenya that would give us a very good understanding of what regenerative agriculture is in practice. So what do you do on the farm? You know, integrating crops with livestock, with agroforestry in practice. Stephen, you can go ahead and play the video.
Farmers in Africa are important to the economy, but also very exposed to climate change. Regenerative agriculture is farming practices that bring back destroyed soil in a way that makes soil healthy and productive, restores biodiversity, and improves the nutrition. That's the future. There are 2 innovative farms in Kenya practicing regenerative agriculture. We have Tamaru using agroforestry and Farmer Max using livestock to regenerate soils.
The story about this farm is not just about chickens. It's about using chickens as a tool to regenerate soil. It was typical to any small farm. It was heavily grazed, it was tilled. We got in 100 chicks and it kind of evolved from that. Over many, many years, the ground was being used in conventional way of farming, which means that over time you have a loss of the microorganisms by tilling it. You're releasing carbon, which is food for the microorganisms. What we're trying to do is stop any disturbance in the soil and try and revitalize it by using livestock to fertilize the soil in a natural way. Conventional poultry farming is usually in confined houses where there's a batch of 3,000–4,000 chickens. Whereas what we do is we take away that pressure by shifting the coops. On the broiler pasture, we have a small dairy herd that we move about 10 days in front of the chickens, and they graze the grass down to about 6 inches. The patties are full of natural protein by the time the chickens graze over them, so it further substitutes their feed in terms of natural protein that they are able to forage and peck at on the ground. What they poop out is our resource for the soil. Their poop is high in nitrogen. They are fertilizing the soil. We are trying to rebuild ecosystem health, and it's effective. And then behind the chickens are the sheep that come in, who also maintain a sort of level of pasture where we want it for the broilers. In other poultry operations, the poop is a burden, whereas for us, it's a tool to regenerate soil. Our system of farming is nature enhancing. If you had a bird's eye view of our farm, you would see exactly where the chickens' coops have been. And the idea is that if your soils are healthy, your pasture is healthy, your animals are healthy, we're healthy, and the planet is healthy.
Agroforestry is the practice of either agriculture in forestry systems or forestry in agricultural systems, so that trees and crops are on the same piece of land for long periods of time. Farmers are able to produce diverse portfolios of food, allowing them to make more income rather than when they are relying on just one crop or one enterprise.
What we're standing in here are actually tunnels that used to grow flowers, and only 2 years ago it was just bush. Lots of weeds, very overgrown, and not much life. It's just amazing that you can bring that all back within less than 2 years. We decided to set up agroforestry because we wanted a food production system that produces superior quality, enhances soil and sequesters as much carbon as possible, and enhances, of course, biodiversity. It was really when we first went to Brazil and discovered the advantages of syntropic agroforestry over any other agroforestry, we realized a lot of the crops that they were using in Brazil are also in Africa. And so we knew we could do it here and just slightly change it ever so slightly just to fit into the local context. So if you can imagine, in a natural forest, you've got lots of different levels. You've got your canopy crops, you've got your emergent above that, you've got your sub-canopy, and then you've got your ground level stuff. In some circumstances, you've even got stuff growing under the ground. And that's what we're strongly mimicking in a system like this. In syntropic agroforestry, everything is planted at the same time, be it from seed or from seedling.
You start planting trees and other crops that begin to grow slowly and helping each other. Fast growers begin to diversify the system and produce food at the onset of the systems.
So you've got a continuously self-propagating family of plants that build the soil for you.
The difference between our tamale and the neighbors is very evident. Our neighbors, the lands are bare, or just one monocrop all the way. If it's dry season, it's just dry that way. But in our system, it's always green, always bushy. In Tamale, we are living in a food forest.
Even if it's just a normal tomato, if you taste it, it's not just juicy, but it has some flavor. It doesn't really matter what it is. If you taste it, it's really yummy.
We've been harvesting very superior quality produce from the farm. We started with families, but now we are at the online shops. We've been selling to restaurants, also locally in Nanyuki and Nairobi. And we are also selling our farm produce to some shops in Mombasa too.
The end goal is to be able to consistently supply those big urban markets, because that's part of the circular vision of this farm.
As chefs, it's our duty to source our food from producers who are really looking after the environment. And I can tell you from a chef's point of view, this is where it starts. This is where you start building flavour. And more you're seeing customers push back and actually demand that their food comes from responsible sources.
The future has got food and feed for everyone. We should not just think about ourselves. We are part of nature. We need to have a stable agricultural system in which we're able to store a lot of carbon in the soil to produce healthy food for human beings and other parts of the ecosystem, and therefore get on a path of growth that is based on the wider concept of circular economy.
Thank you so much, Steven, for playing that video. Now, to continue, we would like to speak to the principles of regenerative agriculture. So what are these principles? And many of them have come out clearly in the video that we've just watched. So when you are doing regenerative agriculture, you want to minimize the tillage that you're doing on the soil. You're minimizing the disturbance of the soil as much as possible. So that is the first principle. So you can use techniques such as zero or minimum tillage to achieve this. Then you also minimize the use of chemicals. Of course, we need chemicals for weeding, we need chemicals for fighting pests, but there are other technologies that you can use instead of chemicals, say biological pesticides like neem oil and push and pull technology that you can use to fight the weeds, but also pests. So the other is maximizing the biodiversity of both animals and plants, as we've seen in the previous video. You have poultry, you have dairy cattle, you have vegetation cover, both the short and tall vegetation in terms of trees on the same area, same farm. So what you're doing here is what they now call circular economy, the circular use of resources. So the plants are able to feed the plants, rather the animals feed the plants by providing manure that give plants nutrients. And then the animals in return give food rather the plants give food for the animals, and both of them are doing so much good for the soil and water conservation, because the manure then ensures that the soil texture is improved, but also the plants, by covering the soil, ensures that the water evaporation is reduced. So all this is to ensure the health of the whole ecosystem on the farm, but also the individuals, humans that depend on the food that comes from this farm. So the fourth principle then is keeping the soil covered, and the fifth is adapting to the local environment. So if the local environment is dry, what you want to do is to find ways of improving the area, maybe by planting trees again. But if the soil environment is fertile, you want to keep it as much as possible, to maintain the fertility as much as possible. Steven, let's go to the next slide. So on this next slide, we are just picking a few things that you are likely to see on a farm that uses regenerative agriculture. So the animals would mimic wildlife as they feed on grasslands and savanna. There will be use of what you can call old methods of crop farming without chemicals. There will be the use of the sun to give energy. So the idea here is to reduce carbon footprint as much as possible, reduce the emission, so manage the energy resource. Then you'll have reduction in monoculture, or monoculture will be not there on the farm. You will have diverse crops and animals, and then restoring the carbon and water cycles. So with these few many words, I would end here and hand over to you back, Steven. But before I hand over to Steven, I would like to mention that there are more videos on slide number 6 and 7. I won't play it here because of time, but they are very important videos that would really give you a more understanding of the concept of regenerative agriculture. So you will have this as these slides are shared after this webinar. Thank you very much. Back to Steven.
Thank you, John. That was really clear, and I love that video. I think it's a really important way of looking at how regenerative agriculture can actually be a part of running a successful farm. And this concept of sustainability, that we are reducing the external inputs onto the land to enable us to continue running a farm, producing good quality food into the future. So there is a large dose of self-interest about why we might engage in regenerative agriculture. But one of the key issues is that as a smallholder farmer, or as a medium-sized farmer, or even as a large farmer, what is the business? How can we secure our business going forwards into the future? And so whether it is we farm in a place where our soils are fertile and rich already, how do we maintain that and improve that and ensure that those soils are healthy going into the future, so that we're able to continue to produce great food? Or is it a case that our soils are becoming degraded, that we are suffering from erosion from water or from wind, that droughts are definitely impacting on our soils, and we have to take on concepts around dry land agriculture to enable our soils to actually improve so that they hold more water, so that they can grow more food. So there are some key issues about why regenerative agriculture is really important, whether you are in a rich equatorial region of Africa, rich in terms of environment, or whether we're in the Sahel, where we know that we have got wind erosion and challenges with heat and lack of water. So what I want to do is pick 5 of the themes that we've already heard about, and really try to do a little bit of a dive into each one of these 5 areas. And so in the next few slides, I want to talk about crop diversification. The idea of moving away from a monocrop, where, for example, we just have a single field that is full of maize, growing mealies, to a farming system where we are growing more crops of different varieties, potentially then increasing the amount of food that we can take off the land, where we are increasing the range of crops that we are growing, creating additional revenue streams. Crop diversification is really important. I want to talk about planting shade trees. As we know from last week's conversation, when we heard from Bobby and in part from Rogers, we know that trees can make a real significant contribution to the carbon markets and potentially for an income stream for farmers through systems such as those run by Rabobank. But shade trees do more than just store carbon. They bring advantages to crop and livestock production as well. Using cover crops is something that we quite often do not think about. But it's an important issue because bare soil releases carbon, which takes away the food, as we've just been told in the video, takes the food away from the microorganisms that live in our soil, and therefore it impoverishes our soil and takes away water because it enhances, bare soil enhances evaporation. So cover crops can retain water and moisture in the soil and also increase the fertility of it through the actions of those microorganisms. We also need, for quite often the same reasons, to talk about reducing tillage. The idea of hoeing a field before we plant our maize is not efficient. And there are ways that we can plant that retains and promotes the fertility of the soil. And lastly, livestock, as we've heard, whether it is cattle or sheep, goats, chicken, these are an important element of an integrated system. And whether that is running livestock for meat, for dairy, for eggs, they can be a part of the system. So let's do a bit of a dive in here. And please, if you have any questions, do go into the Q&A function and post them there, and we'll try to answer them as we move forwards. Diversifying crops, first one. So we really are looking at 2 things here. One is intercropping and one is crop rotation. And these are 2 different approaches to bringing in a wider range of crops to our fields. Now, I must admit, this one interests me. I have a small home garden which I use for growing food for my family, just in a small way. And many of the things that we're talking about in this section are things that I already do in my kitchen garden. The idea of bringing in different types of crops that grow at the same time, or sowing crops at the same time that have got different lengths of growth in terms of time, so one harvests earlier than others. The idea of bringing in plants that perhaps bring in a non-food benefits. For example, this year I have been planting some flowers, both for ground cover. I have been planting some, but also these flowers attract insects to my garden, which promotes both pollination of my vegetables, but it also brings in insects which will predate on pest insects. So using the push and the pull features of some different plants. The idea of using repellent plants, so one of the plants I grow is mint. And this is obviously quite a pungent plant that can have an impact on scaring away some insects. And then there is the issue of trees and shade. And the idea of planting trees either on the boundaries of a field or indeed going down an alley cropping route, whereby you've got rows of trees and you enable crops to grow between them, is really important. And I know that some of my fruits and vegetables benefit from shade that are provided by the hedgerows around my garden compared to some which are in the full sunshine. So intercropping is actually really important. The advantages of this are that it can actually, if you choose the right combination of plants for your farm. So it's not something to do blindly. You need to consider what the soil is in your farm. You need to consider the water of it. You need to consider what plants grow best on your land that will have a market for sale, locally. But the idea of bringing plants together that extracts nutrients at different levels of the soil, different depths, that their root systems, some plants have shallow systems, some have deep systems. We can use this to our advantage. So intercropping is a way of bringing in different types of plants. And some examples of intercropping then, which have been proven to be successful in different parts of Africa, include garlic and tomatoes. Planting these together so that you have got garlic, which can be quite an early harvested crop, with a tomato which will grow for a long time during the season. The idea of coffee and banana, or even linking it into plants such as cacao, are important because some plants, such as coffee, require some shade to come to full fruition. We know in northern Uganda, for example, simsim is a really important crop. And this can be sown amongst maize, as can other things. So one of the videos that we haven't shown, but we share the link with you, is focused on Native America. And Native American agricultural techniques introduced the concept of growing maize with beans and with pumpkin at the same time in the same field. And this combination of crops protects the soil, retains the water and moisture levels in the soil. The maize provides structure for the beans to grow up, and it provides a really strong nutritional foundation for a local community. So bringing together crops can be very, very powerful. And we already know beans, legumes, peas are really important for fixing nitrogen into soil, because a large part of regenerative agriculture is about reducing the amount of agro inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and so on that we use on our farms. And intercropping can help with this. The second point in diversifying crops is that idea of crop rotation. So the idea of having a piece of land where each season we grow a different crop on the same land, and using a fallow period in this, which is a time when we don't deliberately grow anything, although we might start sowing the cover crops, and we might bring livestock into a fallow period as well, to help give the land an opportunity to recover from the crop phase that we've used. Shade trees are, as I've already mentioned, are really important. And trees have got many functions rather than just looking at them as a carbon store. So we know across Africa, there are huge movements about planting trees. And many of these are linked to the Sahel, the Great Green Wall, which we hope will be successful in reducing and slowing the drift of the Sahara Desert as it comes southwards. But trees are really important for people and for the environment. So trees can provide food for people, as well as a potential high-value cash crop, such as nuts, seeds. We know people eat leaves. Some trees, such as moringa, we can use the leaves like spinach. So as a nutritional source for us, trees can be really important. There are species of trees, though, as well, which provide a really good fodder source for our animals. So being able to take off the branches and the leaves of a tree, feed it to our animals, whether it's cattle, sheep, goats, and so on, knowing that those trees will actually regrow very quickly. And the white lead tree, which I've got mentioned here, is an example of that. We know people still use and rely upon wood as a fuel. And the idea of shade trees, particularly those that are fast growing, can provide a source of that. We know as well that trees just provide shade, and that animals provide that animals can actually thrive well in shaded areas. So having trees in pasture land where livestock is being run is an increasingly common thing that we're starting to see. We know as well that certain types of trees can fix nitrogen into the soil, and that promotes the soil fertility. It increases the biome within the soil, and therefore that can spread and impact on the crops, other crops that we grow. And trees fulfill a really important function in protecting against the erosion of water. So Bobby last week and Rogers were talking about the need for trees in sloped areas to slow down the rainfall, to slow down the streams, and to protect the soil so that it's not washed away by the water. And obviously, habitat and biodiversity is really important, particularly as we see the threats against those very factors within our environments. Now, there's lots of different trees that we can use. We have to consider what our environment is, what trees will thrive where we are living and working, as well as what do we want trees for. So if you have a farm and you're wanting to bring in shade trees, it's important to think through what is going to work for you. And one of the resources that we've included here on this deck, which you will get after this presentation, is a tree directory. It's a nice directory. It's relatively simple and easy to understand. And it goes through the different trees that are some of the key species in Africa that can be used and what they can be used for. And then it's up to you to make a decision about, is it right for you to plant shade trees? What do you want if it is? What do you want from them? And what will grow in your farm and in your environment? And therefore, how can you source the seedlings or seeds that you need? Cover crops I've mentioned briefly in terms of the idea of using them either during a fallow phase, where we're leaving our soil to recover, possibly introducing livestock to help speed that process along, but also the idea of cover crops covering the soil of taller specific crops that we want to grow for food that can protect the soil, reduce erosion, reduce moisture loss, and possibly provide other functions such as fixing nitrogen in our soils. And clover is a good one for that, for example, or attracting insects. So if we have a flowering plant that we're using as a ground cover, it will introduce pollinators, but also it will introduce insects that may predate on other insects. Cover crops, particularly those ones that can then be allowed to degrade into the soil, increase the organic matter in soil, which is really important for water retention and for the increase of that biome, all of the microorganisms, insects and so on that live in the soil. And again, this idea of improving water retention is really key. And there's two approaches to this. One is the idea of choosing a ground cover plant that will fix nitrogen into the soil, improving and speeding up the fertility of the soil. And some of those crops can include foodstuffs for people and animals. So peas and beans are really key in this. Whilst other seeds that we may choose and plants that we may choose are non-nitrogen fixing. And again, this can include some cereal crops that provide food for people and animals. It can include grasses, and it can include some broadleaf species such as buckwheat, which is another long-standing food crop as well. So it's that idea again of choosing what system of farming do I want, what will work for me. Remember, farming is a business, as well as what will work best for me in my environment. We talk a lot about avoiding bare soil. And there is a lot of science that has been done that when we look at the way that we get carbon plumes over at the sowing time, when we're tilling our fields, turning it over, releasing the soil, massive carbon plumes that can be detected by our satellites in space can be identified, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So avoiding that, keeping the carbon in the soil is important. And it's important for all the reasons we've already been talking about. Fertility, water retention, not least of all. There are a whole range of different approaches that can be taken to reduce tillage. So tillage obviously can be done traditionally by machinery, ploughing the soil. Otherwise, it can be done, as we see in many parts of Africa, with somebody with a hoe, chopping the soil open to break it and change the structure. So rather than doing those time-consuming hard jobs, we can approach things like dibble stick planting, which is literally where we dig a hole with a stick in the soil and we plant our seedling or our seeds and cover it up, disturbing the soil as little as possible, retaining the soil cover plants that are residue from previous crops that are still there, and allowing the plants to grow up through this. And this retains the soil structure, so the microfungi that are living in the soil are retained. And this can improve, again, water retention, moisture retention, carbon, and organic matter. And there are other approaches as well. Disc plant, strip and spot tillage, as well as ripping, where you actually, rather than taking an individual hole with a stick, you're actually ripping a line, a single line in your field and sowing your seeds along that. So not going too deep, keeping a straight line, not being an invasive ploughing system. So reducing tillage can be really, really important to a regenerative agriculture approach. The last one of these slides is about integrating livestock. And we've already heard on the video from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about the idea of having pasture land that is grazed initially by cattle. Then you bring in chickens, and then you bring in sheep. And the idea of managing a pasture or land, whether it's communal or not, where you are grazing cattle or other livestock is really, really important. And the key part of this is that when managed well, livestock brings in manure, and that this manure will fertilize the soil and promotes the insects and microorganisms and fungi that live in the soil and produce a healthy, diverse soil that we can grow plants in or have livestock feeding off. So the key elements that livestock bring, one is the spreading of manure, which I've talked about, but the other one is livestock trample organic matter into the soil. The weight of a hoof from a cow, for example, will push existing live organic matter or dead brush matter into the soil. And this promotes organic matter being trapped in the soil and bringing all the benefits that that brings. Now, if we're looking at integrating livestock into our systems, we need to consider, again, what livestock do we have? What works for us in the farms that we have and the land that we have available to us? Because obviously a cow will have a different impact than a chicken. And this is down to the size, weight, size of the feet, and therefore the penetration of the feet into the soil, but also the type of manure that those animals and birds actually create. And we also need to consider the topography of the farm as well. Is our farm nice and flat? Is it steep? So that we're ensuring that we're bringing in the livestock that works for us. And what's important is then that within the grazing regime that we introduce as part of our livestock integration, what we're trying to ensure is that there is always a plant cover on the soil, that the plant cover is as high as it possibly can be. So whether it's to your knee or to your waist, that's good pasture land for our animals. And what we can then do is we ensure that the animals that we bring into that space are a relatively high number of animals in a small grazing space. But what we do is we move those animals on a very frequent basis. So we might allow our animals only to graze in a particular area for maybe 1 day, maybe 3 days maximum. And again, it really does depend on you as a farmer making a judgment for your land. But the idea is that when you move those animals off a specific piece of land, what they're leaving behind is land that can recover very, very quickly. And within this regenerative agriculture, we've got 3 things. 1/3 is about the grass is used for consumption of the animals. 1/3 of the grass is trampled, so it's knocked over and pushed into the soil by animals. And that 1/3 of the grass is still there, it's still growing, it can recover really quickly. And then we bring the animals back to that space when it's ready to do so. There is a link to a really good video that goes into this in a little bit more detail. It's an Australian video, but it is relevant to what we're talking about. And so, just to really conclude some of these things. In regenerative agricultural systems, we do it because it makes sense. We do it because it brings in a revenue stream to our farm. It means that we can farm sustainably into the future. And what we do within this is that we keep soil covered, we maintain the root systems in our land, that we're minimizing the soil disturbance, that we're integrating livestock, and that we're maximizing crop diversity. And the whole principle behind this is to retain carbon in the soil, which promotes a healthy biome, so a living soil that retains moisture and promotes fertility. And so, I am sure that there are a lot of questions coming through. So I'm going to invite Sheila to come on screen, and I know Anne has got a few thoughts as well. Sheila, are you there? Would you like to come on screen?
Hi, Steve.
Sheila, have we any questions?
Yes, I have a lot of questions from our participants. Very interesting ones.
So what sort of things are people talking about?
Oh, they have a lot of interesting questions. Let me start with the ones that look more the same. This is from Joyce, Caleb, and Nancy. They're asking almost something around what is the difference between regenerative agriculture, circular economy, integrated agriculture, permaculture, and climate smart agriculture. So, yes.
So I can try to answer that.
Please do.
First of all, Joyce's question, the difference between integrated farming and regenerative agriculture. Integrated farming is really a mix of conventional and organic farming. And if you look at a key word related to integrated farming, it's talking about maintain. So maintaining, fertile soil. Whereas, as we've heard in the webinar this morning, regenerative agriculture is all about restoring. So those two words really sum up the major differences between integrated farming and regenerative agriculture. Now, if we look at permaculture, this is a bit broader, a bit more of an approach that includes ethics, almost a model of society based on respect and sharing. And it's really about promoting all aspects of human life, agriculture, food, education, habitat, and culture, and taking a special care of biodiversity in imitating natural ecosystems. So it's, as we saw in an earlier slide, these terms are very closely interlinked, but there are some differences between them. Permaculture is probably a bit broader because it encompasses more than only regenerative agriculture itself. And then, Caleb's question, which also includes a circular economy. Well, regenerative agriculture is really at the heart of an approach of the circular economy. But the circular economy, again, is a much broader term because it can cover, plastics recuperation and recycling. It can cover all kinds of reuse systems. So the circular economy is a much broader term that goes way beyond agriculture. And if you like, I can, Sheila, I can carry on to try to answer Basil's questions that he has. So Basil is asking, what is regenerative agriculture scale neutral, and how are the economics of regenerative agriculture compared to conventional agriculture? So first of all, is it scale neutral? Well, clearly, if you've got a highly degraded large area of land, a bit like we saw in the video, where they've been growing intensively flowers and really destroyed the soil, and it was just more or less like wasteland. Obviously, if you've got a large area like that, it's going to be, regenerative agriculture is going to bring much more than on a small plot where the soil is still in pretty good shape. So, it's not totally scale neutral. There was a study done recently in the US by the ECDIS Foundation about the profitability, and they studied 20 farms in the US and comparing them to conventional farms. And they found that the farms employing regenerative agriculture are 78% more profitable than conventional farms. But again, this is in the context of, highly intensive agriculture, like they tend to practice in the US. So in terms of economy, it can certainly be much more profitable. There's ways of saving money through decreased input costs, using less fertilizers, pesticides, etc., using more natural means, and input costs go down dramatically. And the other aspect, as Steven talked about, it's diversing income streams. So having additional crops that provide sources of revenue that can be extra cash crops, which can also mean that income is better distributed across the seasons. Especially in the case of coffee, cocoa, where you can sell that only at certain times of the year. You can combine it with horticulture, as we've seen, and have a more regular and diversified source of income. So it really does look different from one farm to another. But and it's the other thing is, I think you should have gathered from what we said, it's really a long-term approach. It's not looking for short-term cash right now, but how we can preserve the land and the fertility for future generations.
Okay, thank you, Anne. The other question is from Gerard, and he asks, can regenerative agriculture solve the problem of famine in certain regions of Africa, taking in account of increase in population?
Yeah, that's a really good question from Gerard. Merci. One of the things that we do see is, and this is more linked to approaches that incorporate trees, is that within the Sahel regions, there is a huge movement to develop the green wall. I've already mentioned this. But a key part of that is it is not just about planting trees to slow down the sand. It's about planting trees within farms and communities that provide other benefits to those communities in terms of that regenerative approach, where the trees are providing environmental services to the farms and communities, but they're also providing food crops, cash crops, fuel, shade to animals, improving the fertility of the soils, so that you then have a regenerative approach developing. So I think the idea again of a regenerative approach, which has got a long-term focus, which is looking at improving very degraded areas, is a really important facet to this concept of regenerative agriculture. And we know that a lot of land faces challenges in terms of erosion, in terms of degradation, and trying to bring in what used to be farmland, which is no longer used, back into service is really, really important for those communities, and recreating the biodiverse environments that have been there previously.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Steven, for answering the questions. And we have another question from Kenneth, and he asks, how can we use regenerative agriculture to approach the issue of soil salinity, especially in areas that are hilly? And also from the video, using the livestock regenerative soil, to regenerate soil, you have models that can be used for small-scale farmers. And I mean, he means that are there any models that can be used for small-scale farmers?
I must admit, and I don't know if Anne or even John has any information on this. I actually don't know the linkage between regenerative agriculture and soil salinity.
Okay.
But what we will do is any questions that we aren't able to answer today, whether it's because of time or lack of expertise, We will get the answers to these questions, and we will put the answers in the deck that we're going to share from this webinar. So we'll make sure that everybody gets a good answer. In terms of models, obviously the videos that we've shown are about significantly large commercial farms, which has been a focus of regenerative agriculture. But we know that there are models which are being developed and being utilized that focus on a smaller scale. So we'll share some more details about that in the deck that we share after this.
And a number of the examples that Steven gave about cover crops and intercropping, I mean, they can certainly be applied without having animals or being able to move the animals around like we saw in the video. So I think there's principles that can be applied on any scale. Exactly, I agree with that. And what I would say, just to add to this, is that David, I see, has asked about links to the videos, for example, and to the tools that we've shared. Those will be accessible in the deck that you will receive from today's webinar.
Dave,
John.
Something about soil salinity and regenerative agriculture. So salinity has causes. For some soils, they are saline. Just that's how they are made. But there are some soils that become saline over time. And for those, I think regenerative agriculture can help. If the salinity is as a result of too much evaporation or poor drainage, then when you use cover crops, you are reducing the evaporation, and then you help on the salinity of the soil. So there is more to do with the type of the soil. That is to say how much regenerative agriculture can contribute. Thank you. Back to you, Steve.
No, thank you for that, John. The last question that I actually just want to address, because I'm aware that we're now at the hour. The last question that we have is from Nakampe. And they're asking about the role of government within regenerative agriculture. And I suppose from my perspective, and again, I don't have a lot of information that I can share on this, but governments are vital within any country in terms of supporting the food system and the agricultural system in countries. And governments play a huge role in providing a regulatory framework. They provide a financial system, and they can provide the grants, the loans, the tax breaks that can make farming successful. And personally, I think that it is important that governments are using the positions that they have to look at developing sustainable approaches to ensure that our farms can feed our populations into the future. And so I would hope that many governments are, as I think some of them are, starting to look at promoting the different approaches within this broad umbrella of regenerative agriculture.
This is happening quite strongly here in Switzerland and a number of other European countries, where, as you say, there are financial support, subsidy systems to promote regenerative agriculture and agroecology. And certainly the Swiss Development Corporation, which is the development agency in Switzerland, is financing that significantly. So this is coming, and I'm sure in the future it's going to be coming more and more into Africa. If we look at how to promote awareness of healthy food and farms, I mean, this came across very strongly in the United Nations Food System Summit, where almost all countries in the world came with pledges, to advance in this area. I mean, pledges are one thing, the implementation is another, but at least, it's being considered, and I think we are moving in the right direction at different speeds in different countries, of course.
So thank you all for your questions. As I say, we're going to try and get some answers, more detailed answers for you if we've not been able to provide the full answer that you're hoping for. If I just move on very quickly, in the deck that you will receive, and you will get this next week, I think, the additional resources that I've included in this one is something cut from what's called the Cool Farm Alliance. And this is an industry platform funded by the corporate sector, by governments and philanthropic organizations. And they've developed what they call the Cool Farm Tool. Now, this is free for farmers. So this is something that if you have a farm, you can utilize. And I know that it is being used by farmers in Africa. Now, it's an online tool. It basically enables you to input data that you have on your farm. So the information that you can access, you put in the information and it will give you a report back on your current status and hopefully how you can further develop. So this is an important tool that is available for free for yourselves. And I've included the links. You'll get these, but you can just do a search on Google or whatever for the Cool Farm Tool, and you'll find it. There's the link on the deck. The other one is, just for a bit of background, we've also included a link to a really impressive report on regenerative agriculture in Africa. And this links back to that question about how we restore degraded land as well. So that's a really useful report. This is just a bit where I say thank you to our sponsors for enabling us to share this webinar on regenerative agriculture with you today. And I would just like to thank everybody for participating. Thank you for Anne, John, Sheila, and also my colleague Jade, who's sat next to me, for supporting this webinar. But more importantly, thank you to everybody who's following the series and who's engaging with us as we move towards the end. Please, thank you. If you have any questions at all, if you've got any thoughts, if you want to find out more about our work, please do feel free to contact us at the Agripreneurship Alliance. And I'm more than happy to answer any emails that come to me at steven@theagripreneur.org. And I know John in Kampala is always happy to talk as well. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm really looking forward to the webinar next week. Same time, same place. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.